The following webinar focuses on the past, present, and future of land conservation easements in the United States. It features Stephen J. Small, the 2015 recipient of the Kingsbury Brown Award from the Land Trust Alliance, as well as the recipient of a Kingsbury Brown Fellowship at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. James N. Levitt, Manager of Land Conservation Programs at the Lincoln Institute and Director of the Program on Conservation Innovation at the Harvard Forest, Harvard University, moderates the session, which was recorded live in Cambridge, Massachusetts on June 20th, 2017. The webinar was collaboratively produced by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and the Government Innovators Network at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Harvard Kennedy School.
Good morning to you all. It is a beautiful sunny day in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We're sitting in the offices of the Ash Institute for Innovation and Democratic Governance at Harvard University, and I have to my left the estimable Stephen J. Small. It is a tribute to Steve that we have 87 attendees online right now and something like 120 people registered for this webinar. We've been doing this webinar series for more than 10 years, and I don't remember a time where there were more people interested and engaged in such a presentation. It's totally a tribute to Steve, who is a Kingsbury Brown Fellow at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and winner of the Kingsbury Brown Conservation Leadership Award, which is the highest award given by the Land Trust Alliance. We're going to play the video that not quite yet, but in a second we're going to play the video that was played at the Land Trust Alliance rally in honor of Steve. But let me simply say that Steve was there at the very, very beginning of tax-deductible conservation easement policy in the United States. In fact, as many of you know, he wrote the policy as a young lawyer at the Internal Revenue Service of the United States. So it is a great honor to have him here. It is a great honor to have all of you in attendance. And with that, Jessica, if you'll go to the next slide. We will in just a second play the LTA video of Steve Small.
The Kingsbury Brown Award was established to recognize people who carried Kingsbury's spirit into the future.
Steve Small is very deserving of the Kingsbury Brown Award. They both really approach their work in the same way, and that is to use the specialized knowledge that they held and share it with others.
So the year is 1980. There's a young attorney at the IRS named Steve Small.
And one of the projects assigned to him was working on the regulations for the Code Section 170 conservation easement legislation.
It was the first breakthrough in what legalities really pertain to easements.
A pioneering piece of tax policy that would make the donation of a conservation easement eligible for a charitable deduction.
We now have a body of law that is very largely attributable to the underlying work that Steve was doing in those early formative years.
That piece of genius changed the path of the conservation movement forever, making it possible for millions and millions of acres to be donated by private landowners for public benefit and for conservation for all time.
35 years later, and Steve has become the preeminent conservation easement lawyer in the United States.
Steve has contributed his intellect, but also his heart and soul to land conservation.
He has played an extraordinary role in defining the silo of legal expertise associated with land conservation.
The land that needed to be conserved was so much greater than the financial resources we could muster. We needed to be able to work the tax angles to take it to the next level.
Steve Small traveled the country tirelessly, talking to people like a Johnny Appleseed, an evangelist for conservation.
The rally alone, he's reached thousands of people.
He's attended every rally, and where he works and presents multiple workshops.
He always got great reviews, excellent speaker, very articulate, very entertaining.
He's been a rock, a legal rock, if you will, but also a friend.
Like Kingsbury, Steve has been an exceptionally capable and generous contributor to the land conservation community.
He not only walked in the footsteps of Kingsbury Brown, but he has the extraordinary bushy eyebrows that carry on the Kingsbury Brown legacy.
Thanks to Steve, millions of acres have been conserved across this country.
So Steve, thanks for being a friend and colleague.
Thank you for all you've done.
And congratulations on receiving this award.
I think you got the story that Steve has really made a tremendous difference. We start our story when Steve was at the IRS, and I want to let him tell the story as best he can. Steve, how is it that you became the principal author of IRS regulations regarding tax-deductible conservation easements?
Serendipity, Jim, karma, destiny, you can choose the word. I went to night law school at Georgetown when I was working on Capitol Hill, and I wrote a paper on the amendments in 1977 to the conservation easement statute that first passed in 1976. And the IRS had a reg project on that. Nothing was happening to it. When I finished night law school, I went to IRS and I asked one of my advisors, how can I get that reg project on conservation easements? And he said, call me in a month, because it depends upon who your branch chief is and what the other assignments are and so forth. And I got to IRS and there were 9 reg projects sitting on my desk, and that was one of them. And one of the reasons that was one of them was when a new lawyer comes to IRS, everybody dumps all the files they don't want on the new lawyer. And I was probably the only one at IRS who really cared about this, and possibly the only one at IRS and Treasury. And so worked out very well.
Now, once you wrote those regs and you spent 4 years at the IRS, how did you transition into private practice?
I finished up in 1982 at IRS, and long story short, I got a great job offer from a Boston law firm. I was in D.C., not necessarily planning to come back to Boston, where I grew up, but I got an offer from the firm Powers and Hall. They're no longer around, went out of business, and people merged into other firms. And came back to Boston, and I was an all-purpose tax lawyer. I left the IRS in 1982. Like I like to say, I was the nation's leading authority on the conservation easement regs, and nobody cared, because there really wasn't that much work in the field then. From 82 to about 87 or 88, I think maybe I had 2 conservation restriction matters, both of them in Massachusetts, and both minor matters. But I'll get to this book in a minute. We're talking about history here. I want people to be reminded of one of the most important events in the development of the current land trust business. The IRS published the notice of proposed rulemaking on these regs in May of 1983. The land trust exchange at that point was, I think, one person underpaid, ran out of 3 Joy Street here in Boston, where a lot of conservation organizations have homes. And the very small land trust community at that time was disappointed that there wasn't a more coordinated response to the IRS regs. And the disappointment was led, at least in part, by the guys from the Montana Land Reliance, and they called a meeting, or there was a meeting. And there were about 15 of us out at a ranch outside of Helena. Feathered Pipe was the name of the ranch. I can mention some of the names. They'd be very familiar. Gene Hocker, Joan Vilms, Jenny Gerard from the Trust for Public Land, Marty Zeller from Colorado, Kingsbury Brown, Bill Hutton from San Francisco, me, There may have been a few others. There were two items on the table. One was, let's coordinate a response to the regulations. And the other one was, pushed by the Montana guys, this new organization, this new land trust exchange really isn't doing a very good job. And we really should close it down. And I'm not sure what their option was to replace it. But what evolved out of that meeting was the idea that Ben Emery, who had run the Maine Coast Heritage Trust for some time, one of the real pioneers in the field, Ben Emery would take over running the Land Trust Exchange, and he'd be given a year or so to see if he could make that work. Well, the rest of the story is there were 15 people in November 1983 at Feathered Pipe in Montana, and LTA was almost shut down, and the first Land Trust Exchange rally was in Washington, D.C. in 1985, 2 years almost to the month after the Feathered Pipe Conference, and there were 200 people there. And so the transition from a struggling infant organization to something that had a lot of power was really a very important change. But again, the short answer to the question is in the first few years at Powers and Hall, there really wasn't much conservation easement work, and I did very little of it.
So, Steve, when did you begin, now that this nascent organization grew into something of some size, when did you begin lecturing and thinking about publishing information with regard to easements?
In the 1980s, if you wanted to develop a piece of real estate and you needed a lawyer to help you through the development process, there was rows and rows and rows and shelves and shelves and shelves of books on how to develop a piece of real estate. All kinds of legal issues, local issues, state issues, federal regulations, cash flow analyses, everything. If you wanted to protect a piece of real estate, the bookshelf was empty. And that's a very important starting point, because what I subsequently learned was this was a field that was starved for attention. We put a program together up in the North Shore of Massachusetts in December of 1987, and there were 3 people on the panel. It was Kingsbury Brown, me, and Warren Flint, who was a land planner who did a lot of conservation work. And it was aimed at people who had family land that they loved, who were threatened by the estate tax then, because the estate tax threshold that year was $600,000. You could have $600,000 worth of value and not pay any estate tax at your death. So if you were a dairy farmer in Vermont and you had a dairy farm near the interstate and that dairy farm was worth $1 million, if you didn't do any planning, that would have to be sold to pay the estate tax. And that was really the theme of the program that we put together on the North Shore. Well, one of the women who put the program together approached me afterwards, and she said, Stephen, this stuff is really important. Don't you have something in writing that we can hand out to people that explains this? Again, there was nothing. The bookshelf was empty. And I said, sure, I can do that. I envisioned it really as a series of memos. What's a conservation easement? What are the tax issues? What's a land trust? What does an appraiser need to know? Things like that. And after I had a bunch of the memos done, I thought, you know what? If I clip them together and put a cover around it, it's a book. And that's how Preserving Family Lands began. My law firm stood behind the publication. The first printing in the spring of '88 was 4,000 copies, and I figured my parents would end up with 500 of those copies. We sold them for $2 each, and all the buyers in that first round were land trusts. The Virginia Outdoors Foundation, the Land Trust Exchange bought some, the Brandywine Conservancy, Bill Sellers, Piedmont Environmental Council, Bob Dennis. They would buy 200 copies of Preserving Family Lands and give them away. Give them to landowners, give them to banks, give them to lawyers, give them to trust departments, and that's how it started.
So the key insight was this was really a primer for professionals and for individuals and families that wanted to engage in conservation easement.
Exactly. The preserving family lands, I followed the instructions of my friend on the North Shore. Don't you have something that explains all this? And the principle was, it's a primer. It's how do you do it? What's a conservation easement? What are the tax issues and so forth? And we printed the 4,000, they sold out. We printed another 3,000, that sold out. We printed another 6,500, those sold out. I gave a speech in central Massachusetts about then one night to a local land trust and came home and I said to my wife, you're not going to believe what happened tonight. I talked about land conservation and taxes and people applauded and they laughed at the couple of jokes I told and I got paid for it. I think maybe I'm onto something. And as I say, I was blessed to be in the right place at the right time because the field was really unserved at that point. Lawyers around the country knew nothing about conservation easements. There may have been 2 or 3 exceptions to that. Accountants, banks, trust departments, wealth managers, it was a field that needed some good literature.
So Steve, you went on from book 1, which was updated and revised several times, to write Preserving Family Lands, book 2. When was that published and what was the key insight in that second volume of this trilogy?
I forget when it was published, but early 90s maybe. Book 2 and book 3, which we'll talk about in a minute, I think reflected my understanding of the evolution of the field. In the beginning, landowners and land trusts thought, okay, we'll get Aunt Sally to sign a conservation easement on her farm and she'll give it to us and we'll record it and that's the end of the transaction. And I began to realize that things were a little bit more complicated than that. You know, I like to say in the beginning we knew the answers to all the questions, but that was because we didn't know what all the questions were. And I found that a lot of families were very, very interested in passing land to the next generation, what I call succession planning for family lands, and that's really what book 2 was about. It's about using vehicles like wills and trusts and partnerships and things like that to be able to get land to the next generation. Very important observation. Every professional advisor in the country understood the concept of succession planning for family businesses. Plenty of literature, plenty of seminars, plenty of information available. Almost nobody understood the concept, which was completely new, succession planning for family lands, and that's what book 2 tried to address.
So then a third book came along, and what was the genesis of that and the big message?
Same idea, Jim. It evolved out of my continuing understanding of the continuing evolution of the field. One of the things I noticed, I actually have a copy of book 3 here, and let me read just a paragraph. When I wrote Preserving Family Lands, good literature on this subject was impossible to find. More than a decade later, good literature on this subject is still much too difficult to find. Interest in conservation easements continue to grow, but the ability of private sector professionals to support this field has lagged way behind. Too many organizations with no experience, no guidance, no checklist, and no criteria are now accepting conservation easements. I was talking about many of the folks that might be on the phone today, and by the way, I love the attendance list, and hello to all my friends and others out there. And book 3 was a more advanced version of book 1. Book 1 was the simple stuff, book 3 was the more complicated issues, but to me, the principal contribution of book 3 was the second part, part 2 of book 3, was a checklist on how to do a conservation easement project right. All of the due diligence things that needed to be done, like running the title, like understanding the mineral interest issues, like making sure you know who the correct owner of the property is, like making sure the land trust that's accepting the easement is in good standing. And I found that so many people still viewed this as a lovely piece of work. We're going to help Aunt Sally protect her land, but it was becoming apparent to me that these transactions really should take on, for planning purposes, more like a business transaction. with a lot of I's that needed to be dotted and a lot of T's that needed to be crossed.
So, Steve, over the course of the 10 to 15 years that you were publishing these 3 books, the land trust community grew dramatically. We went from maybe a couple of hundred land trusts to more than 1,000, at least up until the present day. I think there are 1,100 or more active land trusts in the United States, and from very small amounts of land protected to a cumulative total of something like 54, if my memory is correct, 54 million acres of land protected in the United States with the assist of land trusts using these instruments and others. Your practice of law, particularly in this field, grew alongside this larger community of practice. And if we can go to the next slide, we have a map of several of the places that you've worked. Can you describe just a little bit the range of clientele that came to you? And I'm really interested in the story of how you finally reached all 50 of the United States.
First observation here is whenever I finish a speech or a presentation, folks will say, "Thank you for coming." And my response is, I only go where I'm invited. And this was really driven by phone calls and letters, and this is before email, that I got mostly from land trusts around the country saying, will you come out and do a program for us? The typical program was I'd fly out in the morning, in the evening I'd talk to landowners or talk to board members, some kind of a smaller group. The next morning I'd do a continuing legal education program on the tax code issues and the basics and so forth. And there were attendance would range from 30 to 150 at those, depending upon how urban or how rural and the outreach that the land trust did. But the invitations came from the land trust people. And in the beginning, I got occasional clients. People would say, I have your book. And I'd say, yeah, but have you read it? So I have your book. I've read your book. I need your help. Can you help me protect my property? But a lot of my early referrals came through the land trust community, which leads me to a very important observation about this work. In the beginning, and my wife worked with me a lot, Connie worked with me a lot on this side of the business. How do I get the word out? I've written a book, I've written a couple of books. How do I get the word out? And we found going through other national conservation organizations like Ducks Unlimited, like a Humane Society or wildlife organizations, really didn't get us very far. We also quickly learned that most people with a lot of land in the United States, number one, didn't have the same zip code. Number two, didn't belong to the same organizations. Number three, didn't read the same magazines. So it was very difficult to reach out to landowners. And I finally concluded what was staring me in the face, and it was that the way to reach out to landowners is to reach out to land trusts. Because landowners are so spread out, even within the land trust community. The best land trust in the country probably has not yet reached out to all of the potential landowners in its service area. So I couldn't do that. But I had hundreds of programs. I traveled a lot in the late 80s, early 90s, and mid-90s, and it would be, again, typical day or 2 days. Sometimes I'd do 3 programs in one city, and then I'd move on to the other. I remember a couple of decades ago, I did 3 speeches in Santa Fe one day, and then we drove up to Taos, and I gave the same speeches in Taos, and I was partway through the 3rd speech, and I sort of froze. I said to myself, wait a minute, did I say this to them already? Have they heard this already, or did I say this yesterday in Santa Fe? So it's sort of all blurred together. But what happened from those speeches and what happened from those continuing legal education programs, not only were landowners educated, but land trusts were educated. And land trusts came to understand a lot more of these issues. I'm not a real estate lawyer. I'm not a flora and fauna lawyer. this is a tax code provision, and that doesn't fit well with most well-educated people in the United States. It's a different language. And so the outreach went through the land trusts to the landowners. And I've done wonderful projects, huge projects in the Northeast, a couple of big ranches in Texas, a couple of big ranches in Colorado, some plantations in Mississippi, a couple of wonderful transactions down in Florida. And I could go on and on. People say to me, what are the most beautiful parts of the country? What's the most beautiful part of the country you've seen? There isn't one, because so many parts of the country have their own unique kind of beauty. The low country of South Carolina, the Grand Tetons, going around a bend in New England in the fall, and a little farm with the foliage, the California coast. So I've been very lucky, and again, as I like to say, I only go where I'm invited, so thanks to the invitations from all the land trusts.
So I think you've brought up a very important point, which is that you're a tax lawyer going around the country talking to people about land conservation, which underscores the fact that a great deal of the interest in land conservation is undergirded by the fact that there's an opportunity to do conservation finance here. That the incentives that were provided, are today provided by the federal government, don't compensate landowners typically for 100% of their land, but that tax incentive which gives them part of their money back in terms of reduced taxes has spurred a movement that is now nationwide in scope and much, much larger and much more influential than it was when you had that meeting in Montana almost 40 years ago. Steve, having covered the nation and all 50 states with advice on conservation easement tax law and related topics, you have more recently written a book on the business of open space, What's Next. This is your fourth book that you publish and make available on your website. And I think this is a topic of particular interest to the 120 people who are sitting out there online listening to this presentation. So can you give us a little bit of insight into what you think is next for the business of open space?
I think one of the first things there were two things really that got me thinking about the need for another book. Number one, I saw some gaps in the current field that weren't being filled. For example, open space that's owned by a town, open space that's owned by a college, open space that's owned by the county, that people take for granted as open space. And it's not restricted, and it could be sold. And many of the people online today know examples of situations like that, where property that everyone thought was open space would stay open space, but if it's not protected with a conservation easement, it won't. And I wanted to try and talk about that a little bit, and we've actually seen a couple of great examples recently, including Middlebury College, a wonderful program where they protected a significant amount of acreage up there with a conservation easement. Another thing I found troublesome, and it's funny because when I first started to admit this, I thought, well, that's a change, is as we all know, the IRS is now very heavily involved in the conservation easement business. Many people listening would say they're more involved than they should be. That's a different discussion. But I came to the conclusion, and I know I'm not the only one that feels this way, that Section 170H of the tax code and the conservation easement provisions are limiting. It's in perpetuity, but IRS doesn't like amendments. It's hard to draft a conservation easement that works for 20, 30, 40, 50 years out. You can't anticipate everything. And I began to think that we need new tools like conservation easements, not to replace them, but to supplement them, that provide more flexibility. And I haven't seen that grow yet much, but it's still on the table, and I think it's important to mention it. But the real epiphany for me was, and this is in chapter 2 in my book, my friends down at C2I Investments in Middleburg, Virginia, let me tell you the first deal they tried to put together, okay? And I'll preface it by saying we think of conservation easements as extinguishing development rights. You're a landowner, you can build a 40-story office building, you can subdivide your property, you can pave it over. A conservation easement extinguishes those rights, and it reserves the right to do farming and agriculture and forestry and so forth. But land has a lot more attributes and resources and qualities than those we have traditionally thought about as either extinguishing or preserving with a conservation easement. So the first deal these guys came up with was they went to a bunch of landowners in the southeast with the WRP program, the Wetlands Reserve Program. And I'm not an expert on this program, but let's start with a simple model. The WRP program pays a landowner a check every year for 15 years not to farm the property and to preserve wetlands and so forth. And again, this is a generalization, but so they get a check for 15 years. And the C2I guys said, you know what? How about if we write somebody a little check up front, and then we give them a stream of income from years 15 to 40. Okay, they're getting a check from WRP for years 1 to 15. We'll give them a check from years 15 to 40, and what we will do is we will buy from them the bundle of rights associated with their real estate that they are not currently using. They can continue to farm, they can hunt and fish, recreational activities, and so forth, but that bundle of rights includes a whole bunch of other rights associated with every single acre. Carbon credits is the most obvious example of this today, but their view is we're going to capture these rights, we're going to hold them. At some point in the future, there will be more markets for more of these resources, like water credits, like green credits, like urban garden credits. I mean, you just name it. These fields are waiting to open up. And I thought to myself, this is brilliant, because it sort of turns around the conventional thinking about conservation easements. Instead of saying you can't do any of these things, what it says is you can continue to do these things. Are we still on the air?
Yeah. We are still on the air. Hold on just a second while we get the computer image back.
I can keep talking.
You can keep talking, right.
You know, we need to think of all of these other potential resources, and this is what Jim was talking about with conservation finance. I think, Jim thinks, the C2I people think, a few other people, not enough yet, think that in fact we can attract millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of investment money into deals with sound conservation results and assets that can be traded in the marketplace at a profit without hurting the land, and in fact with protecting the land. I was at the seminar at Texas Tech, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, and environmental issues and so forth, and I said to the folks there, and most of them are authors, you know, what underpins every single environmental issue that I can think of is open space. If all the land in this country got paved over, you all wouldn't have anything to do. But if the more open space we can keep, I don't have to tell the people on this program all of the qualities that can be protected: clean air, clean water, climate. You can keep going down the list. And I think that we've done great with conservation easements. We've done great work with government funding. The business has thrived for 30 years on conservation easements and government funding, but we need a bigger toolbox. We're entering a very significant period of transition right now. A lot of land in this country is owned by landowners who are older. And as my definition of elderly goes up a little bit each year, that land is going to change hands. and it's going to potentially change use over the next 5 to 30 years. So we're in a very important period. I think conservation easement's a great tool. Government funding's a great tool. Nobody knows what's going to happen to that, but we need a bigger toolbox, and that's what that book is about.
So I want to remind the audience that there is a question box, Q&A, that I hope if you're thinking of questions for Steve, you write them there so that at the end of this question and answer session that I'm having with him, we can address some of your questions. So let me invite you now to click on that and send us typewritten copies of your questions, and then we'll address them in a minute. Steve, as an undergraduate at Yale and then as a law student at Georgetown, you were taught both to write very well and to read and appreciate good writing. And in fact, you became quite a collector of books focused on conservation and the environment. How did that happen? How was it that you started buying up and saving for yourself at first these exquisite books on conservation?
Around 1990, 91, 92, I'm not even sure when, and I don't even remember the transaction, but we had just closed a very important conservation transaction that I'd worked on for a long time. And I was working with the firm in downtown Boston then, and I went out at lunch and I said, you know what, I'm going to buy myself a present. Congratulate myself, just enjoy this a little bit. And I really didn't know what I was going to get. Maybe a new tie. I think I still drank then, you know, so maybe a really good single malt scotch. And there was one of the better and older bookstores, rare bookstores in Boston, and in fact in the country in downtown Boston. And I wandered into the bookstore and I said to the owner, you have anything interesting here, any interesting environmental books that I might be interested in? And he said, yes, we do. And he pulled out a copy of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and it had a ripped cover. And those of you who collect books know that if it's got a ripped cover, it really cuts into the value quite a bit. And he said, we'll give you this for $100 because it has a ripped cover. And great, and I bought it, and I brought it back, and I put it on my desk, and I brought it home, and I looked at it. I didn't read it yet. I read it, and I looked at it, and I looked at it some more, and it talked to me. It just spoke to me. And I started to follow the book conventions, and I started to go to shows, and I started to get catalogs. And over the years, I acquired, and we'll talk about this as far as different categories, but generally two buckets. One was the stuff we're going to talk about that has traditional classic environmental value, and the other was a lot of books that came to me through the course of my work, people that I worked with, clients who'd written books. I had a couple of wonderful people in the field who had also written books, and we exchanged books. And my collection grew, but it was, again, I remember when I bought Thoreau's Seasons, 4 volumes, summer, fall, winter, spring, or autumn, I think. And I put it up there on my bookcase, and I looked at it, and I said, wow. It's amazing that I own that now.
So Steve, the 3 categories I've learned from watching the tape of your presentation at Texas Tech that you discuss are the conservation classics. That's the first bucket. Second are books written by the activists in the 60s and 70s. And category 3 is books of the big outside that we'll get to as well. But before we go into those particular categories, and I'm going to ask you to read some quotes from some of the books that you most like. Can you describe how you came to donate a collection that had hundreds of books into it recently to Texas Tech University's library?
The gift came out of necessity. We were actually downsizing, and I didn't have room to keep my book collection. I thought, what am I going to do I had done a lot of work with a book dealer in central Massachusetts named Ken Lopez. I don't think he's any relation to the author Barry Lopez. And he said, you know, they have a great collection of environmental literature at Texas Tech. Let me see if they're interested. And long story short, that's how they ended up there. It was great that they were willing to accept it and keep it all together.
And they have at Texas Tech this Soul collection, which is really an extensive collection of environmental books, and they like to make it available to scholars from all over the country.
Their real emphasis is contemporary environmental literature manuscripts and works in progress and drafts and things like that. And for example, they have a lot of Barry Lopez stuff. They have a lot of Terry Tempest Williams stuff. I think they have some Gretel Ehrlich, McKibben. I'm not sure, you know, I can cover all of them, but my collection didn't really fit with what their mission was. But when they saw what I had in my collection, they said, gee, we've got stuff from some of these authors. I think we would consider it an honor to add this to the group. So that's how it happened.
So let's do something that I think would be fun. And if you'll go to the next slide, Jessica, ask Steve to read a couple of passages from several of these books in each of the categories, and then describe just a little bit what those passages mean to him. So the first would be a passage from Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, which, as you just described, is the first book that you collected in this collection.
And not only that, I like collecting Silent Spring, so I probably ended up with 7 or 8 copies and a number of copies of her other books too. I think when I said this book talked to me, these quotes that we have here talk to me. They move me to a different place. I'm not at home. I'm not in an office building in Cambridge. I'm not in an office building in Boston. From Silent Spring, to stand at the edge of the sea, to sense the ebb and flow of the tides, to feel the breath of a mist moving over a great salt marsh, to watch the flight of shorebirds that have swept up and down the surf lines of the continents for untold thousands of years, to see the running of the old eels and the young shad to the sea, is to have knowledge of things that are as nearly eternal as any earthly life can be. And in fact, that quote's fine with me without even the last clause, because in the beginning, I read it and it brings me somewhere else.
So next slide, please, Jessica. We have a quote that you like to use from time to time in some of your addresses, and it is especially prescient given that it was written by Henry David Thoreau in January of 1861, some 30 years before the first land trust in the world was created.
I've read this a lot, and I add a line at the end. Think of the common sense, really, in this. What are the natural features which make a township handsome and worth going far to dwell in? A river with its waterfalls, meadows, lakes, hills, cliffs or individual rocks, a forest and single ancient trees, such things are beautiful. They have a high use, which dollars and cents never represent. If the inhabitants of a town were wise, they would seek to preserve these things, though at a considerable expense. It would be worth the while, Thoreau says, it would be worth the while if in each town there were a committee appointed to see that the beauty of the town received no detriment. And that's when I always add, Thoreau didn't know it, but he was talking about land trusts.
Yeah, that's just a shockingly good quote. All right, so the second category that you have are books by people like Edward Abbey and Dave Foreman and their many friends who were quite outspoken advocates for wilderness and for land conservation, particularly in the 1960s and 70s and 80s and then thereafter. So we have a quote here from Desert Solitaire, which is one of the books in your collection, from Mr. Abbey.
Wilderness is not a luxury, but a necessity of the human spirit, and as vital to our lives as water and good bread. A civilization which destroys what little remains of the wild, the spare, the original, is cutting itself off from its origins and betraying the principle of civilization itself. That's a great motto for Abbey's thinking about wilderness.
Right, and I think underscores the fact that while conservation finance has a lot to do with the growth of the land trust movement over the last 40 years, there is in fact a moral and a spiritual basis for this that reading people like Abbey and Rachel Carson and Henry David Thoreau remind us of in a very poignant way. So then we have a third category of books, and this is an author that I have to admit I was not familiar with before I started talking to Steve about this, which is novels and books, as Steve calls it, of the big outside, which I think is a notion that you got from Dave Foreman.
Yes.
There are two quotes from A.B. Guthrie, Jr., one from Fairland, and a second one that we'll get to in a minute. But Steve, can you read this quote from Guthrie's book called Fairland?
One of the things that Guthrie captured in his books was what's gone. And that's the setting and the thinking behind a lot of his literature. Time, he thought. There was no such thing as time then, now, or ever. Time was always. It was the changes, the trappings along the way that a man reckoned his life by. Rendezvous, dead and gone, along with plenty of those who had enjoyed it. Beaver, nigh gone. Fur companies and some sometime mountain men making out with coarse furs. Before a man knew it, the buffalo might all be killed off. Mountains lasted, and what else? The sky, maybe the high plains and the riffling grasses. Though like as not, men would find a use for the land and gouge it up so as to raise turnips and cabbages or some other truck not worth eating. Before that was done, he, that's the speaker here, aimed to have a long, good look again.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful piece of writing, and I should note that Guthrie, I have learned now, won the Pulitzer Prize with this next book that we're going to look at called The Big Sky, and this is the last quote, Steve, that I'll ask you to read, and then tell us a story about how you came to select this.
This quote is more of the same, like the last one. I love this one, though. The hills were easy and wooded at the mouth of the Cheyenne, and farther on, cottonwood and a few elms and small ashes and buffaloberry and currant bushes made a lane for them. They saw elk, 30 of them in one bunch, and white wolves chasing along the bluffs, and once Boone and Summers and Jim came on a little place fenced in with poles, which had a post in the center, with fading red and a buffalo head raised on a small mound of earth. Summers said it was medicine to make the buffalo plenty. They saw trees scarred high by ice that had gone out in the spring, and beaver cuttings and beaver tracks galore. Summers looked hungrily at the sign and explained that hunters let this country be because the Rees are Indian tribe, Arikara, because the Rees claimed it for their own. More of the same. Again, this Big Sky is about the mountain men, the first people out there looking for beaver and trapping and hunting and so forth. A magnificent read if you haven't read it. I have The first copy of Big Sky I got, again, I bought from a dealer, and it was signed by A.B. Guthrie. It was inscribed to a friend of his, and it was dated Choteau, Montana. That's C-H-O-T-E-A-U. If you speak French, it looks like Chateau, but in Montana, it's Choteau, Montana, July 1947. And I had that book tucked away, and for our 25th anniversary, my wife and my 2 daughters and I went out to Pine Butte Guest Ranch in Choteau, Montana. It's owned by the Nature Conservancy, and that's how we celebrated our 25th anniversary. And one night, the manager said, you know, Carol Guthrie, A.B. Guthrie's widow, lives nearby, and she's coming by for dinner later this week. And I thought, oh, my God. And I called my office manager back in Boston, and I said, there's a couple of Big Skies in my office. Just grab one and overnight it out here. So the second Big Sky I have is inscribed by Guthrie, but it's also inscribed to Steve Small from Carol Guthrie, Pine Butte Guest Ranch, August 1997. Almost 50 years to the month after the first Big Sky I had. But the third one is actually one of my favorite stories. Again, I saw it in the catalog. It was a Big Sky, and it was inscribed by A.B. Guthrie to Margaret McElderry. Margaret's not a well-known name. Some of you may recognize that she was in publishing in New York, did a lot of children's books, but very well known in the field and very well known in New York literature. Margaret McElderry was a client of mine around 1990 or 91 or 92, whenever it was. She had some land on Nantucket that she wanted to protect. And it's one of those tough site visits, but I flew over to Nantucket when she was there, and we met in the morning, and I went out to see some other people, and she said, come back around 5, meet some of my friends. If we're not here up at the cabin, up at the house, we'll be down at the beach. And I got there at 5, and there were 4 or 5 people down at the beach, and I walked down to the beach, and one of the people she introduced me to was David Halberstam, who was standing in the group. And she said, David, Steve Small has some books himself. He does land conservation work. And Halberstam said, and that's very interesting. He said, you know, my wife's family has some land, I think in North Dakota. I'm not sure, North or South Dakota. And we were just out in Wyoming, and I was talking to some of the people there about land conservation. And in fact, somebody gave me a book on land conservation. And I said, were you at the Jackson Hole Land Trust? And he said, yes. And I said, were you talking to Story Clark from the Jackson Hole Land Trust? And he said, yes. And I said, did she give you a copy of Preserving Family Lands? He said, yes, that's it. And I said, I wrote that book. And he looked at me and he said, you wrote that book? And I had to bite my tongue because I wanted to say, and what do you do for a living, David? But I didn't. So that's one of the things, when I get deep into my collection, the connections of how meeting Dave Foreman for a drink in the bar of the Tucson airport led to my awareness of his catalogs of books of the big outside, which led to reading Guthrie, which led to meeting Carol Guthrie, which led to meeting David Halberstam. And I love those connections.
Well, Steve, you have really brought this full circle beautifully. It really is about all the things that you have written and done in the land conservation field, and the generosity that you've shown by giving this collection of books to Texas Tech and available to scholars in perpetuity. For those of you who are interested in a link to Steve's remarks given at Texas Tech when he presented these books to the university, it's available on Steve's website, www.stevesmall.com, under the speaking banner. And then for an annotated list of the books that Steve donated to Texas Tech, you can go to the website that's listed here, which is on the Kennedy School website, and it's just a remarkable list that goes on for 25 pages. Now, Steve, before we take questions from the audience, and I want to let people know that we're going to go 10 or 15 minutes over time because we don't really have a constraint, and if some of you have to drop off, we understand, but we want to engage in some of these very thoughtful questions that have already been submitted or any others that you want to submit. Can you tell us what the drum set is at the bottom of the picture?
Just to show you all work and no play and so forth. Texas Tech is in Lubbock, Texas. And Lubbock, Texas is also the home of the Buddy Holly Museum. And this is actually the room in the house of Buddy Holly's drummer, where they wrote most of their classical songs, including So there we go, add a little lightness. But I have to say, I was a DJ in college, and good old rock and roll has a very warm place in my heart, along with my book collection.
Excellent, excellent. All right, so last slide, please, Jessica. So I just want to put this in context. Steve was the 2015-2016 Kingsbury Brown Fellow. He joins a long list now of others who have, like Kingsbury Brown, really made a mark on this community of practice to which I think everyone in this webinar belongs. This is a picture of the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts along the Connecticut River, which is just full of federal and state and private and nonprofit land, which has been protected in perpetuity. Now, Steve, I'm going to move to a couple of questions and invite anyone who has additional questions to ask. But the first one is a very simple question from Joseph Stein, and exactly the kind of question that Steve is used to addressing, which is there a minimum amount of acreage necessary to create an easement? Are there things that are too small to worry about?
Too small, I guess it depends on how you define too small. But the short answer to the question is no. The issue is, does the easement protect some significant conservation values? And in fact, the IRS issued a letter ruling some decades ago on a conservation easement on a 1/4 acre lot. It was in Rhode Island, and when you drove down the road, you could look across the lot to see the ocean, and preserving that view for the public to drive down the road and see the ocean, the IRS deemed worthy of qualification. And I think that's the same answer. I've done a lot of easements that are less than 5 acres and a couple that are even less than 2 acres. Obviously, if it's too small, there may not be important habitat. And also, if it's too small, the income tax deduction might not be very big. So that's another relevant issue.
All right, thank you. So Julian Mole Rosek, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, asks, looking forward, I see a growing awareness for the need for land restoration. And in the academic community, this is a separate field from conservation. How does the current legal framework inhibit or incentivize restoration of ecological function?
I'm not sure the current legal framework incentivizes it. I don't think there's any disincentive right now. I've had a couple of people, actually I'm working on a conservation easement now in Kansas, and the owner wants to build a little bridge across a creek, and the land trust said, you know what, build the bridge first and then put the easement on it, and then we don't have to worry about whether the easement allows building a bridge. You can restore a piece of ground and bring back conservation values and be eligible for a conservation easement, I suppose. That's one way of looking at it. I know some of the thinkers in the land trust field are talking about in areas that are built up, acquiring a piece of property and removing structures and letting it grow back to a natural state. Again, there isn't a current incentive for that, but this is the kind of thing. I mean, this fits really well, Jim, I think, into the what's next question.
Right.
Can we look for restoration incentives other than mitigation banks for real estate developers who destroy one wetlands and have to create another one? And so I think that's something else valuable to put on the list.
I will say, though, that the mitigation banking industry, both in the United States and increasingly internationally, is really focused on restoration of sites that can bring ecosystem services back to a place where they've been lost. And there are real financial incentives for that kind of work, and I think they're growing in sophistication over time. So I'll ask one more question, and I think at that we will thank everybody that has been here for your attention, and thank Steve for just an incredible job, both from his head and from his heart. So Steve, could you please comment on any innovative tools that you've heard about from urban land conservation? It seems that perpetual easements may not be appropriate in more urban settings, particularly for things like community gardens. And that came from Ann Jones.
Great question, and I think actually conservation easement could work for community gardens and in other urban settings. We did a conservation easement 15 or 20 years ago in one of the more crowded urban areas in New Jersey. The landowner had purchased a house, and essentially there were a couple of acres of parkland next to it. It wasn't protected property, but he put a conservation easement on the parkland, and it was right in the middle of the city. And it absolutely could have been built out. It was zoned for 5 or 6 houses on the additional 2 acres. And same thing with an urban garden, community garden. One of the issues, and this is the lawyer in me on this one, is how is ownership held? Because sometimes the form of ownership can interfere with potential tax benefits. But if people think about that at the outset and how to structure these transactions, I think urban open space absolutely, under the right circumstances, can qualify for a deduction.
All right, with that, I want to read a button that Steve has on the table in front of me. Steve is famous at Raleigh, as many of you know, for his buttons that express all kinds of interesting thoughts. This one says, "New ideas, more acres." And I want to thank Steve for coming up with new ideas and protecting more acres for over 4 decades in this, in the midst of the growth of the land conservation movement. And we look forward to working with you in coming years, Steve, as you continue to come up with new ideas and protect more acres.
Thank you, Jim. Just one more observation, and that is in 1989, the Trustees of Reservations, which is a statewide land trust in Massachusetts and the oldest in the country, awarded its annual Conservationist of the Year award. And there were 2 winners that year, Kingsbury Brown and me. And when I accepted the award, I said, isn't it remarkable that the 2 people who have won the Conservationist of the Year award are both tax lawyers?
All right, with that, I will thank you all for your attention. I thank Steve for his wisdom, and we will be back in touch with you early next fall to continue this series of webinars. Have a great afternoon.